Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to see you. My name is Sundown, and this is Logically Free Spirited, a channel where I talk about all things scientific and spiritual while remaining grounded yet open minded. And this video is part of a series where I break down each episode of the incredible, it's my dog, paradigm shifting podcast, the Telepathy Tapes, summarizing each episode and going into more detail about relevant topics that I find interesting that they just didn't have time for. And today we are talking about episode 5. So, if this is your first time seeing my face or you are just not caught up yet, I will link to the playlist somewhere on the screen and in the description box below. That is also where you will find links to all of the different resources I may mention throughout this video. So, okay, we're all friends here. Let's get into it. In this episode of the Telepathy Tapes, we shift from the home to the classroom, where we meet incredible teachers working with students across the autism spectrum. Like the families of Mia, Akil, Houston, and John Paul, these teachers also report experiencing the unexpected phenomenon of telepathic communication in their classrooms. I'm going to start with Marie, a teacher in the Chicago suburbs. She has over 20 years of experience working with non-speaking autistic students and says that in the last 5 of those years, she's come to realize that all of her students are capable of telepathy to some extent. And she added that many even see spirits and at times predict future events. Now, I know that this is not the first time that we're hearing about some of these kids seeing spirits, or at least things that the rest of us aren't regularly seeing, if ever at all. But this is the first time any sort of future prediction comes up. And honestly, it's only mentioned for a brief moment, so I'm not going to really go into that part right now either. I think Kai Dickens, the host, is right in that it's important to lay all of this information out in a very intentional manner in effort to not lose the audience. So that's where that topic will sit for now. But mainly because, in my opinion, one of the more fascinating takeaways from Marie's interview was her external validation of the Hill, the telepathic channel, if you will, where non-speakers can go to communicate and learn and teach one another. Kai actually interviewed Marie before the second episode of the Telepathy Tapes even aired, meaning that she had not yet publicly mentioned the Hill, and yet Marie brought it up completely on her own, leaving Kai stunned. Marie says that her students regularly talk about going there. One student shared that while he sometimes encounters his classmates on the Hill, he usually spends time conversing with friends that live in Canada and Denmark because they have more similar interests. He says that one has a particular penchant for bees and the other likes to talk about the environment. And I think that's so amazing. I mean, this is remarkable not only in its own right, but because Marie mentioned it completely on her own, completely unprompted. Kai had not said a word when she brought it up. Also, it reminds me that in the newest episode of the Talk Tracks, Kai's side series, she interviews someone who has actually known about the Hills since the 80s or 90s, I believe, but she knew it as the lollipop line. So apparently the newer generation gave it a name update. I mean, the lollipop line is really cute and adorable, but I do think the Hill has a better chance of ever being taken seriously. Anyway, Marie is not the only one talking about this. There is also Carrie, a Pennsylvania-based speech language pathologist and teacher with over 27 years of experience. Because of the professional risk involved with discussing this topic, she did choose to use a pseudonym. Also, another sidebar, a speech language pathologist is someone who works with people who have communication and or swallowing disorders due to conditions like autism, but also things like stroke, brain injuries, or developmental delays. They typically do this by providing therapeutic exercises and strategies to help each individual, and you will regularly find them working in schools, hospitals, or private practices. Anyway, while I don't recall if Carrie specifically mentions the Hill by name, she did describe her belief that non-speakers are communicating via some type of grid or shared network. One example she gave was the use of certain slang words among her students, like the word ploink, which according to them means something akin to play. At first, she noticed her students spelling or communicating this word in class, but then in a completely separate instance, she encountered the same word being used by an autistic adult who had no known connection to any of these children, further reinforcing the idea of some sort of shared telepathic space. Carrie also had plenty of experience in witnessing telepathic communication one-on-one with her students, but she did share an instance where it happened in front of multiple people at the same time. She and two paraprofessionals were working with a student when he suddenly became very distressed, which a paraprofessional is essentially a professional teaching assistant in these types of scenarios and roles. Anyway, once the student was calm enough to communicate, they asked him what was wrong, what was bothering him. And he explained that he was upset because one of the teachers was going to be leaving to go to the beach. At first, this didn't really make sense. I mean, no one had mentioned having any plans to leave, but then one of the paraprofessionals realized what had happened. She had just received a text message from her husband saying that his car had broke down in Atlantic City near the beach and that she was going to have to leave to come pick him up. She said she had already seen the message and she knew she would be going, but she hadn't yet told anyone else. The student reacted before she had the opportunity. Then Carrie said something else. As I mentioned before, she had experienced telepathy with her students one-on-one, but not just telepathy like we've seen so far in the series. This time, Carrie could actually hear the students' thoughts in return, so two-way telepathy. And once again, she's not the only one. Another teacher, this time retired and based across the pond in Somerset, England, is Jess. She taught speech and language impaired children from the late 80s until her retirement, though she still works regularly with many of her students. Jess explains that the first time she began to question if telepathy was happening in her classroom was after a new student, Asher, arrived. Asher was fairly verbal at first, but Jess noticed that soon after he came into her class, he seemed to influence the classroom dynamic without actually speaking. She also witnessed, after a while, all of her non-speaking students playing games in perfect coordination without any verbal communication, kind of like a flock of birds flying in unison.
Wow.
Each one of these kids seemed to intuitively know what the others were doing without any sort of verbal cueing. But Jess didn't stop there. Once she realized that telepathy might be a play, she reflected on how her students actually sort of trained her without her even realizing it. She recalls working with a student one day when she suddenly felt another student beaming at the back of her head, silently trying to get her attention. Everyone knows that feeling of being stared at. Well, without turning around or looking, Jess essentially responded out loud, telling the student by name, "Please be patient, I'll be with you in a moment." That's when Asher suddenly shouted, "She got it!" And the entire class erupted into applause. Jess then realized that the goal all along was for her to become receptive to them the way they were receptive to her. Again, two-way telepathy. Jess goes on to explain that over time, Asher actually stopped speaking altogether as an adult, saying that telepathy was simply more efficient. Jess also had another student, Max, who actually communicated with her audibly, with a voice in her mind. She said she didn't know how she knew that the voice belonged to Max because he was completely nonverbal. She had never heard his voice in a traditional sense, but she knew it was him. She could also hear him from anywhere, from different rooms all the way across the school. While Jess had experienced two-way telepathy before, at this point, Max was the first non-speaker whose voice she could actually hear in her mind. Kai asked Jess if she had ever shared her experiences before, and Jess explained that she had been hesitant to discuss telepathy due to the stigma surrounding it. She mentioned that she had a colleague who was actually sent for psychiatric testing after attempting to relay telepathic messages from students to their parents, who then went and reported this to the principal. But this brings us to Casey, another teacher, this time in the South, who also works with students with developmental challenges. And like the others we've heard from, she realized that some of her students had telepathic abilities. And like Jess, she began to also hear students' thoughts audibly in her head. Casey tells a story about one of her telepathic students, Jay. After testing her theory repeatedly, she shared her discovery with Jay's mother, with his permission, of course. And his mother was emotional but not surprised. She said she knew he was special. Together, they decided to approach the school principal, only to be completely shocked when the principal did not seem, in fact, surprised themselves. It was revealed that the school already kept a list of students that had this type of ability. This led Casey to believe that schools working with these students must, over time, become aware of these telepathic abilities, at least in some of them. So here we have a stark contrast. One teacher is nearly institutionalized for simply speaking to parents, while another discovers that this phenomenon is not only acknowledged, but perhaps more common than anticipated. And here enters Marianne, a retired teacher from Wisconsin who first witnessed telepathy in her classroom over 30 years ago. And she has actually been personally documenting and validating it ever since. Marianne describes her students' telepathic abilities as spiritual gifts, and over the years, she conducted and recorded her own experiments to explore them further. Of course, this was also with the caregiver's permission and the students' personal willingness only. One of the examples shared on the podcast was an experiment involving 3 students identifying the color of Lego blocks that were being held over or maybe even on their heads. I don't really remember which, but either way, they weren't able to see the blocks, yet they correctly identified the colors. These students consistently were accurate time and time again. And there was also a Scrabble test, which seemed to work kind of like a random word generator. The student would enter the room after a word was generated and then type the correct word without being exposed to it every time. The particular student in the experiment recording actually used what's called an AAC device that spoke the words out loud so you could hear them. And that stands for Augmented Alternative Communication, and essentially it encompasses electronic devices that convert text or even symbols into audible speech. And I just wanted to bring that up because we've mostly seen letterboards at this point. Anyway, it wasn't just the telepathic abilities that Marianne noticed. It was the depth of knowledge that some of these students displayed. Similar to what we've heard before, Marianne believes that many of her students have access to a kind of knowledge base that they can tap into telepathically, but adds that the communication methods available to them, like letterboards and these AAC devices, are simply too restrictive. She likened it to trying to suck an elephant through a straw. And of course, this makes me think of my last episode where we talked all about the Akashic records and the collective consciousness. So is that what Marianne believes they're tapping into? Anyway, all of this was happening in the 1990s. And like I said, Marianne recorded everything, sending her videos to anyone and everyone she thought should and hopefully would take interest. She reached out to quantum physicists, universities, and institutions, searching for outside validation, but no one cared. Marianne wasn't just observing telepathy. She was actively testing it, documenting it, and trying to get people to pay attention, but instead she was ignored, dismissed, censored, and ridiculed. So here we have different women, each with a distinctly different experience navigating telepathy in the school system. Casey came to believe that at least some of the schools working with neurodivergent students are well aware of these abilities. Jess saw firsthand what happened when her colleague tried to speak out. I mean, she was sent for testing and nearly institutionalized. And then there's Marianne, who took it even further by reaching out to schools and universities and medical professionals and physicists just to find no one willing to listen. And of course, she wasn't the only professional in this space to face such resistance. Susie Miller, a speech-language pathologist and author, also had firsthand telepathic experiences with her students. Experiences that were so profound, they actually made her question her own reality. And now, far from questioning her reality, she actually works specifically on helping families to connect through this telepathic bond. And Susie's stories are incredible. In the podcast, she discusses the beginning of her career in 1999 when she met a young autistic boy who was around 4 years old. She described sitting in a room with him so the two of them could get acclimated to one another when she suddenly began to notice a white light that was floating above him and moving around with him as he moved around the room. I mean, naturally, she couldn't believe her eyes. And then she said she heard this voice, this little boy's voice in her head that said, "That's my light body, and you're here to help put my light body back into my physical body." At the time, Susie had no idea what he meant or how she was going to help him, but she describes that over the course of the year, she continued to listen to this little boy who then guided her into helping him reintegrate into his physical body, an experience that was, of course, massively spiritual and transformational for Susie. I wish they would have said what happened afterwards, though. Like, what happened to the boy after the year-long integration? I mean, I'm sure he was still autistic, but had his apraxia lessened? I'm just speculating. I wish I knew. Anyway, part of his integration included tuning forks, and I am fascinated by this. So here's where we're going to veer off for just a little bit. Susie explains that the boy asked her to bring in tuning forks to their sessions, and when she did, they went one by one through each fork until he had identified and called attention to two particular tones. He explained that one tone was his soul tone and the other one was his body tone. And Susie says that when she played them together, you could literally see the boy start to physically regulate within his body. This was obviously astonishing. So this is one of the methods that she continues to use with clients ever since. And I find this so interesting. I mean, there's something about the story that really sticks with me. The way that the boy identified his soul tone and his body tone and how playing them together helped regulate him feels like it's a part of something much bigger. I mean, sound and frequency have long been used to influence the mind and body. Brainwave entrainment, for example, is the idea that external rhythms like binaural beats or steady drumming can shift brainwave frequencies into states of relaxation, of focus, or even altered consciousness. Many believe that certain frequencies have healing properties. I myself keep specific playlists laced with different hertz frequencies depending on what I may need in the moment, like 40 hertz for focus or 432 for anxiety. And then there's the gateway experience, which I'm sure many of you already know about this, but just in case you don't, the Gateway Experience is a CIA research program, or was, that used sound frequencies, specifically Hemi-Sync technology, to alter consciousness. The idea was that by playing two slightly different tones in each ear, the brain would synchronize into an altered state, potentially allowing for out-of-body experiences, remote viewing, or expanded forms of consciousness. I actually started listening to the tapes myself, and I was unable to stay consistent, but I do plan to give it another go. And all of this information is now public, so I will link more about it in the description box. Once I get through the telepathy tapes breakdowns, this is exactly the type of topic I anticipate talking about, which makes now a perfect time to casually remind you to please like and sub and comment. Until being on the other side of this, I really didn't know how much of a difference it really does make to creators. So thank you. And even if you don't like and don't sub, just thanks for being here. Thanks for listening, sincerely. Anyway, back to the Gateway Experience and the tuning forks. All of this makes me wonder if two different tones, one in each ear, can stimulate an OBE in someone considered more neurotypical. Could a similar approach, customized to the individual, help an autistic person not have an out-of-body experience, but perhaps a deeper in-body experience? Could it help them feel more grounded and regulated compared to their natural state? That seems to be essentially what Susie is explaining. Tuning forks are commonly used in sound therapy, often to stimulate specific energy centers known as chakras or to regulate the nervous system, helping to restore balance and alignment. In the woo world, we have things called sound baths that play kind of a similar role. Some theories suggest that each person has an innate frequency or vibration, which correlates with the little boy having to work with Susie to find his two specific tones. And this makes me wonder, are all non-speakers naturally more attuned to sound and frequencies and their effects? And if certain frequencies can regulate emotions and energy, could that explain why some individuals gravitate towards specific sounds or tones? And personally, I have misophonia, an intense sensitivity to certain sounds, and I'd like to know how that may fit into all of this, if at all. I don't have the answers, but I can't stop thinking about it, so there's that. Anyway, Susie also said that at some point the same little boy asked her to bring in colors, and in effort to oblige, she brought in these large color scarves. It turns out he wanted her to place the scarves over them when doing schoolwork, and when she asked him why, he explained that essentially he could take all of the information they were working on and he could put it into a color, and then he could absorb the color as opposed to being able to absorb the information via pictures or words. And honestly, I can barely wrap my head around that one right now. But either way, despite all of these incredible experiences, Susie still stresses the importance of verifying telepathic messages from these students and continuing to consistently use letterboards for credibility. And now, like I said, Susie actually helps families strengthen the telepathic connection with their children. I have no idea how she does this, but it does sound very interesting. And I really want to check out her book, Awesomism. Okay. Someone else who is very interested and featured in the podcast is none other than Rupert Sheldrake. I swear I've talked about him before, but for whatever reason, I couldn't find it in my previous notes. So Rupert Sheldrake is a biologist and author with his PhD from Cambridge, who has spent years and years studying the phenomenon of telepathy among other similar subjects, such as validating the feeling of being stared at or animal owner telepathy. He's known for challenging conventional thought and being a very, very large thorn in the side of many a materialist, which honestly makes him a perfect guest for the Telepathy Tapes. He said that there's been tons of telepathy research done in peer-reviewed articles and added that it proved to be repeatable and to him irrefutable, and says that the critics are just not interested. So of course, I went and I looked for these articles, and I still have a full-time job, and for now, this is still a hobby. So admittedly, I couldn't look for as long as I would have liked to, but I did find something really interesting. It was an article from 2014 in Smithsonian Magazine. And honestly, I do not generally trust the Smithsonian thanks to the Y-Files, but this covered a study done by Starlab, a Barcelona-based research institute, and a French firm called Axilium Robotics, and then the US's Harvard Medical School. And the study demonstrated brain-to-brain communication. The experiment used EEG sensors, i.e. what we keep talking about with Dr. Jeff Tarrant, using an electroencephalogram. But they used these EEG sensors to essentially transmit binary codes to individuals, which were then interpreted by the recipient's brain via transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is also known as TMS. Essentially, it's a non-invasive treatment that uses magnetic pulses to stimulate nerves in the brain cells, right? Yeah. Essentially, participants successfully conveyed words not through speech, but through brain signals. The article also references another study conducted at the University of Washington using a similar setup that actually stimulated the participants' brain's motor cortex to subconsciously cause the person to strike a key on a keyboard. It's implied that this is considered less worthwhile because it was subconscious, and the participant in the study with Starlab was conscious of the messages. Regardless, these studies suggest that the brain networks may allow us to pick up on others' intentions or emotions, potentially explaining telepathic-like phenomena. To me, this sounds a lot like empaths, which I've said before I resonate with. So anyway, Kai notes that Sheldrake's theory on what he refers to as the mental field is one of her favorite takeaways from his work. He believes the mind to be field-like, essentially extended in space, not confined to the inside of our brains like materialists tend to believe, but rather protruding externally beyond the body. He compares it to the fields of cell phones, microwaves, and magnets, and notes that materialists do not generally hold issues with things like gravity or electromagnetism. that behaves similar. And in the same way, he doesn't feel like it should be a leap to believe that our brains could have a field that extends beyond us, therefore, possibly impacting, overlapping, or merging with other nearby mental fields, like the merging of consciousness that Manisha described experiencing with Akil in episode 2. They go on to discuss mental telegraphy, a term coined by Mark Twain after an incredible experience where Twain wrote a letter to a friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in 11 years, about the idea he had for a book, and then he sent it off. A few weeks later, he received a letter in the mail from the very same friend, but it was postmarked the same day he sent his letter. And then the contents of that letter were about a book idea, an idea exactly like the one Twain had. Essentially, the two of them wrote eerily similar letters to each other at the same time and then sent them on the exact same day, despite having not spoken to each other for over 11 years. It seems highly improbable, but it happened. They compare this to kind of like when you text a friend and they tell you that they were just thinking about you at the same time. I swear to you, things like this happen to me every day, especially with a few specific people. And it's gotten beyond weird at this point, but I love it every single time. Anyway, Kai and Sheldrake conclude their conversation by talking about the biological context of two-way telepathy. Sheldrake explains that he believes that there are resonant connections between members of social groups that allow them to remain linked even when far apart. For example, parent and child, but also to teacher and student, and simply friend and friend. He says that when these connected people are together, it's very clear that they are part of a shared mental field, that they are essentially in sync. And he believes that even when they are not physically together or directly within each other's mental fields, that that connection or syncing remains. It does not break with distance, which I think is beautiful. I mean, I interpret that as saying that you'll never not be connected to those you love and who love you in return, be it distance created by space, time, life, or death. Potentially, we could stay connected to those we care about. And I think that sounds amazing. That's essentially where this episode ends. But if I remember correctly, and I think that I do, the next episode is actually my favorite. So in the meantime, please take a look at the links below. Specifically, I highly recommend checking out the Gateway experience if it's new to you. I'm really excited to eventually get to talk about that one. And also, I can't believe we just talked about two-way telepathy. I mean, honestly, it almost seems like it should be more shocking than it feels. And I think that's because just the shock of deciding that telepathy is real was so big that everything now feels possible. It feels like anything is possible. And I know that that can be considered a dangerous thought, but that is specifically why my channel is called Logically Free-Spirited. I do try to remain logical yet open-minded. So anyway, I love you guys. I'll see you soon, I promise. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks. I'll see you soon. Can you hear that siren? I'm so sorry. Or men.